Hi, everybody. I'm Mike Westendorf, and welcome to another edition of Great Questions, Great Conversations. It's a podcast that we host here at St. Paul's in the Bridge in Muskego, Wisconsin, where we talk about any number of topics from theological to practical. And oftentimes the questions lead to some fantastic conversations. And this is, I think, going to be another really good one here today. Our guest today is Joel Gaertner, both the pastor, but also the director of WELS Special Ministries and the former director of Jesus Cares Ministries. And so we want to welcome Joel in and say, good morning, Joel. How are you doing? Welcome to the podcast.
Mike, thanks for the opportunity. Good to be with you.
Yeah, we had a chance to be able to meet about a week ago or so, and we have a need that has kind of arisen for us to be able to look harder at, and so as I was talking with Joel, we just started thinking, okay, how can we help our congregation be a congregation that welcomes people with special needs? And while that's kind of the underlying purpose, there's a number of things that are going to come out in this, and I've got a wonderful sheet that Joel sent me that is very helpful when it comes to helping people with special needs. But I want to talk to you first, Joel, and get your reaction to this one, because I think we kind of need to deal with a little bit of my own trepidation of, oh, they're different. And sometimes in special needs spaces, I grew up oftentimes thinking about Jesus' story of bringing the little children, or better yet, his cup of cold water, and that idea of the least of these.
Mm-hmm.
Whenever we talk about the least of these, my mind would go to people who have developmental disabilities, or people who are clearly in a different reality of life, Down syndrome, things of that nature. And as I've gotten older, and as we've talked a little bit too, it's just kind of confirming it's not just potentially offensive, but I think it may also be the wrong mindset when we think about the least of these. And so I want you to respond to that. When you hear the least of these and special needs, are those two the same in your world? And how would you re-articulate that?
I think it's good to have an awareness, like you said, that they are different. But the biggest thing is they want to be treated just like you and I do. One of the favorite things I always like to say when we talk in this area is treat them, interact with them just like you would anybody else. Certainly you want to be aware of their situation in life, and understand, hey, is there something I need to do to accommodate them? I mean, that's a conversation I have with people all the time. There are certain accommodations we have to make. But at the same time, sometimes people, like you alluded to, they get scared, they get afraid, and so then they back off and they don't do anything.
Right.
Think about how you see someone that what are you going to do? You're going to walk up, you're going to put a smile on your face, you're going to give them a handshake, maybe a hug, and that type of thing. And you're going to find out our friends with special needs, I say, are probably some of the most friendly and warm and welcoming and inviting people you're going to get to know. And you give them a hug, and you make it into a hug that you're going to have a hard time getting out of, which is not a bad thing. But at the same time, being aware of their situation. Is there something we have to do to help them feel comfortable? And you think about, in a worship situation, one of the things there that is often a challenge for some of them, there are any number of us who like good, loud organ music or music in some other way. And those sensory issues are sometimes the biggest challenges in a worship setting for our friends with special needs. That is a big thing to be aware of. You see some of our friends with special needs, they're covering their ears. I was in a situation just earlier this week with a group of my friends with special needs, and the one guy is walking around the entire time with his fingers at his ears because things were too loud and disturbing for him. Mm-hmm. And the thing is when they have those different reactions, the fingers in the ears, maybe just acting in a way that to us doesn't seem normal. Let's not exclude them, or let's not make them feel uncomfortable because of their behaviors. That's the way God made them, and that's the way they act. And that welcoming and including part is recognizing that's who they are. And let's not be offensive to them with it.
Why do you think, in your experiences, because obviously you've been counseling and coaching people on this, but you mentioned help our friends with special needs feel comfortable. And the reality of it is for a lot of our people, when we encounter people with special needs at first, until you get used to it, it's uncomfortable. Why do you what's been your impression on why people tend to be uncomfortable around people with special needs?
Because we don't necessarily understand their behaviors. We don't want to do something wrong. That's the biggest thing I've heard is people, well, I don't want to do anything wrong. And like I said, just be yourself. Go up to
I
them.
let me jump into that. And so I don't want to do I don't want to do anything wrong. What is what's behind that? There's got to be a little bit more of a story because I do hear that. I hear that on a number of different
Yeah.
levels, like even for volunteering. Like I don't, but what's driving that? Do you think?
Well, and I think people don't maybe know, is there something special I have to do because their situation may be different? And it's one of those notions that people have in their head that it's just, we got to get that out of their head. Why should that person be treated any different than, the quote, typical person whom I interact with on a regular basis?
Right. So how do we help people get there in terms of being comfortable around people who make them uncomfortable? And what and I it, so you're gonna find with me, I like kind of digging in on some things.
Yeah.
Um, because I'm thinking of one of the beautiful things about that I've grown with through people with special needs is that I look at the outside world and there are people who scare me. I was walking through the park this morning and there's a couple people who I'm watching going, I probably have to keep an eye on that until I get up to them and then I have the exchange and very pleasant. I'm much more at ease. So we all have that threat analysis that we kind of go through. And one of the beautiful things that I've seen with people with special needs is that they're never that kind of, well, at least in my experience, they haven't been that kind of dangerous. And they help me maybe have a little better attitude toward the people who do make me legitimately afraid because of the stereotypes that I might be living with. Um, I, respond to that
Yeah.
idea.
Well, and I think the reason people feel uncomfortable is because their behaviors may be a little bit different. When you and I were talking last week, I talked about the two brothers in the last congregation I served. They
Yeah.
would burst out with something in the middle of the sermon. I got used to the way that's the way that Stevie and Scotty acted. It took my two associates a little while to get used to it. We have a box in a lot of ways where people's behavior should fit inside this box. And if they're not inside that box, either A, I don't like it, B, I'm uncomfortable. And I think one of the bigger challenges is the way that our friends with special needs have been treated. You just watch it as you're out in society, the way that people make fun of them, the way that people scare them, stare at them, the way that people exclude them. And that's why the biggest thing is, what we can do to overcome those barriers and the way that they have been treated for decades and decades and decades is a huge thing to be able to, just get past that and, make them feel welcome and included like we do with anybody else.
I think what I'd like to do is we think about how, particularly for us in the church, can serve these people. You mentioned two things, two ways that we react, and I think it's good for us to tackle both of these, but I want to do it in a specific order. I don't like it. I think that one's a really interesting one, and then I'm uncomfortable. I do think that those are two different reactions. But before we go and talk a little bit about coaching and helping us as Christians wrestle with I just don't like that, or it's just not appropriate, or I'm uncomfortable. Before we do that, let's talk a little bit about uh, people with special needs, and let's dive into a little bit more of just talk to us about the people and what you've noticed the people and their deep desires.
And like I said earlier, they want to have the same things that you and I do. And what has happened is because so often in society we term a person with a disability, we tend to immediately put them in a different category. Why? Like you said earlier, Jesus welcomed the least of these, Jesus welcomed the little children and everything else like that. And we have gotten to a point in our world and in our society where things aren't in that, typical area, or things are just a little bit different. We tend to get a little skittish, we get put off, and we don't necessarily act as welcoming or loving or including or Christ-like as we can or should. And so, like I said earlier, just going back and, just like I'm going to go up to my friend and give him a handshake or a hug and have a smile on my face, why should I not do the same thing with those individuals? I'll tell you, I've gotten to know that community, and there's a bunch of those friends in a bunch of different settings. They're often the first ones to do that. They'll come running up to you, they'll give you a hug and that type of thing. And, how are you? And, and then the conversation goes on. Hey, what have you been doing? Just like you and I do when we haven't seen each other for a while, we catch up on things. And that's the exact same thing that they want to do. And I think trying to make it as normal for them, even though we may have to swallow a little bit of our uncomfortability, that's the best thing we can do to show them that Christ-like love and welcomeness and includingness.
Hmm. Tell me a story about the warmth of one of your special friends.
I have probably one of my best memories of that is a young man that I know who his father helped me get the Jesus Cares program started at the last congregation I worked at. And I'll tell you, anytime I see him, and I'll sort of keep an eye out if I know he's going to be there, but he'll come running from wherever and he'll just come running across the room and, give me a big hug and a big smile. He's nonverbal, so he doesn't say a whole lot, but his actions say absolutely everything. And it's neat to have that. I've had that scenario happen over and over again. Like I said earlier, I was with a bunch of those individuals just a few days ago. I was at one of our camps for people with special needs, and it's the exact same thing. I mean, they don't even think about it. They just, they come up and they give you a hug and, hey, how are you, and everything else. And I mean, it's just like, hey, we just picked up where we were before, and it's a wonderful feeling.
How did you get into this special ministries and working with people with special needs? I mean, there's always a story that comes behind that.
I say that God has all the way along been preparing me and getting me more ready for this. Each of the three congregations I served had an individual or more than one individual with special needs. First congregation I served, I had two sisters. One was typical, one had cerebral palsy and was basically nonverbal. And her two means of communication were she shook her head no for no, and she clicked her tongue for yes. So here I am, a brand new pastor out of the seminary, and I've got to learn how to boil my confirmation class down to yes and no questions.
Mm.
And at the same time, keep it in a way that her sister could learn as well. And so we went, and the reason I ended up with those two sisters is unfortunately a pastor in another Lutheran church told the parents, I'm not going to do your daughter's confirmation class. And they came to me and I said yes. And then I'm like, okay, what did I just sign up for? And the cool part about that story, I always fast forward to confirmation day. And, I had, Jenny and Debbie up there. Jenny's staying there in her white robe. Debbie's sitting in her wheelchair in her white robe. And I would ask the questions. You would hear Jenny say yes, and you'd hear Debbie click her tongue. And I tell people, I think we were two questions into the confirmation vows, and there was not a dry eye, because of that. Now you fast forward a little bit further. It was about 3 or 4 years ago. Debbie was called home to heaven. That's another one of the things that you understand with our friends with special needs. There's a fair number of them that their family and loved ones understand they don't have a long life expectancy. And I found out 3 or 4 years ago that Debbie was called home to heaven. And while her family misses her dearly, what do they talk about all the time? Now she's made perfect. She can speak. She can everything else like that. I just had a conversation with another family that's got a loved one with special needs about a week ago. And the father shared with me with a fair amount of emotion in his voice. He says, we know we don't have long left with our daughter.
Yeah.
And then he put the question to me, it's like, what an opportunity. He said, when that time comes, are you willing to do her funeral? And absolutely.
Yeah.
But again, if you would meet that young lady, she lives life every day. She's aware of her situation, but she lives life every day with no regrets and nothing but a big smile on her face and joy in her heart. And just everywhere you see everything she does, she expresses that joy that she has.
I really appreciate you sharing those stories and some of your heart behind that. I know I don't know if you were at the concert, but many years ago at a former congregation, we held a Jesus Cares concert in a park, and I remember um, speaking with some of our friends, with special needs, and I remember one of them just telling me again in the kind of the broken English and just trying to get it all out because cerebral palsy had bent his body, but how much he loved Jesus because he couldn't wait to get to heaven when he will give me a body that works like everybody else and I'll be able to run. And just like the gleam in his eye as he was saying, it's like I can see the day. I can see the
Yeah.
day. This is just a shell. And even though it's trying to get all of the words out, I'm just watching and marveling at again that that faith that sees the goal. He's going to bring me into a new reality, and I can't wait.
Yeah. And I'll bet you at that concert, our friends with special needs were the ones who were singing the loudest. They're just enjoying it, right? I mean, and that's another part of it is they worship. There's the old saying, dance like no one is watching.
Yeah,
These people, they don't care what people think of them because they're just living their life like who they are. And that pure, simple, unabashed joy is just something that I admire. And I'll be honest, I seek to emulate and know that I fall short. And that's where I've had a lot of times families who have a loved one with special needs say to me, what a blessing that is an individual is to them. I've never heard one of those families talk about their loved one with special needs as a burden. They talk about them as a blessing. They certainly acknowledge the challenges,
right.
the blessing that individual has been to teach them to live life with joy and happiness and overcome those challenges. That's another thing that to me is just absolutely amazing. I watch any number of our friends and the way they have not let something stand in the way and they overcome their challenges and they do what they want to do and no complaining or anything else like that to me is just an absolutely amazing thing.
Yeah. Let's uh let's pivot a little bit and let's talk about in our day and age of mental health, and I now say this less and less, or more and more tongue in cheek. The normal people, because nobody is normal. I remember when Salty Earth put together the Open Door, that movie, and Jeske, what was his name? Who played
Michael Jeff.
yeah, Michael Jeske's statement. I just never forgot it. Uh, some of us wear our disabilities on the outside, but many of us wear our disabilities on the inside. And when you step back, and especially with the mental health explosion that has happened here, where the stuff inside is just blowing up outside of us, in a lot of different ways. You're seeing that I might look normal and I can talk and I can communicate, but I'm as broken on the inside as you are on the outside. And oftentimes, those who are broken on the outside have a humility and a zeal for life, especially those who know the simple message of the gospel, have a zeal for life that you'd almost wish you could, and God will merge those two, the best of
Exactly.
those two together, and we'll call that heaven.
Yeah.
Um, I'd like to help us wrestle those who would be a little bit more normal on the outside with the two things that you mentioned. That a lot of times there are two objections that we have, and sometimes it's almost unconscious. It's not like we're trying to be this, but if you've never been face to face with it or immersed in it to some degree, you typically have two reactions. I don't like it, and it's just, or I'm uncomfortable. And so I would like to change, start with the more gracious one, which is I'm just uncomfortable. I want to do something, and we're going to take words and actions in the kindest possible way, and assume that I and many of the people in our churches fit into that category. And there are probably a couple of things that I would say that when I've gone through this, the I'm uncomfortable thing is the communication barrier is a real challenge. Um, the person with special needs oftentimes, and you mentioned this, they have a significant lack of self-awareness. That's not what they've necessarily been gifted with. And when we meet somebody without self-awareness, quite frankly, sometimes trauma goes off on us because we've dealt with normal people who are abusive like that. But lack of self-awareness, the challenge of communication, and then I think the physical, that you're coming face to face with something right out of the pages of Scripture when Jesus talks about the lame. And so
Exactly.
if you can, what I'd like to do is I'd like to take those three ideas. Help me, Joel. And I'm gonna be the church member who would like to be able to be more helpful, but is really uncomfortable. Help me with these three things. First, I want to start with their lack of self-awareness. How can I grow in my understanding of their lack of self-awareness?
I'll go back to what I've said several times is accepting them for who they are. And I think put ourselves as the person, what kind of a message are we sending to that person with special needs? If all of a sudden we bristle at or we make some sort of reaction that shows that person, well, I'm uncomfortable or I don't like how you're acting. What message are we sending them? I think that's the best way we can look at it is instead of putting up all sorts of barriers. And I think that's what they become, right? And putting up barriers with the way I act or speak or don't speak or something like that. How can I instead just force myself into that uncomfortable situation and be welcoming and including to that person?
You know, is your with that answer, the lack of self-awareness that we see in the other person, probably a really good starting point would be for me to step back and examine my own lack of self-awareness.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
And that my lack of self-awareness becomes the barrier.
Exactly. Absolutely.
Mm. That's really, I think that's very, very helpful. Um, yeah, to step back when I see that. And I think that would kind of fall under that physical thing. When I see the physical differences, it makes me a little afraid and I don't know how to process it. And um, yeah, how step back and help me understand what does it look like to be the hands and feet of Jesus in that moment, and have a greater sense of my own self-awareness. How do we deal with the challenge of communication barrier? Help me communicate with my friend with special needs better.
Now, and the way I always do that is I communicate with them at first, like I would with anybody else. But then all of a sudden, when I get to the realization, okay, maybe this individual can't speak, or one of the ones I've had a number of individuals with special needs where it will take them what might be an uncomfortably long period of time to get something out. And God has taught me a ton of patience. Letting that person, they're not going to speak freely like you and I are doing right now, but it's going to be almost seemingly painful, one word at a time, and just let them do it. Or if I get to a realization that maybe I can't communicate with that person like we normally do, it's only after I've tried everything else, that's when I turn to their caregiver, their parent, whoever is with them and say, okay, help me. What's the best way for me to communicate, with them? Or how's the best way for them to communicate with me? I think of a couple individuals I know who, yes, they can't speak verbally like this, but they use some sort of a communication board, and that's their voice. And it's just absolutely amazing to watch them do that. Or I think of another young man who I know who the only sounds that he makes are a lot like you hear from a lot of our friends with special needs, these deep guttural sounds. But he uses a thing called the rapid prompting method, and it's just the letters on a little piece of paper, and he does like this, and he spells the stuff out. and the stuff that he shares is absolutely amazing. That the one thing I've heard from a ton of these parents is you'd love to understand everything that's going on in their child's head and help them get it out. And we're seeing more and more of that, whereas we're understanding we have to come up with different methods of communication. This rapid prompting method and the stuff that this young man shares as he does this, it's been typically on this piece of paper, and now his mom's trying to follow what words is he spelling out. It's now gotten to where it's a computer and he can actually type the stuff out. And then people just sit there and are like, wow. The simple expression of his faith, the deep thoughts that he shared. The other one that, and this is the uncomfortable one, when some of these individuals start communicating, they share with you how people have made them feel. And it's the old, the head wants to go down because they're like, I've felt shunned. I've had people make fun of me and everything else like that. And I think that's where it sometimes makes us take a step back and go, okay, how can I overcome this so that this individual does not feel, excluded and shunned and everything else like they've had to deal with for decades in their life?
Yeah. I'm going to speak back a few things. Start a conversation like everyone else. Um, be patient. You just shared that, embrace their vulnerability. I've noticed that too, that they'll be willing to say things that you wouldn't say in polite company. In fact, this is a bit of a tangent, but something that's relevant here. One of the interesting things that's come out of COVID in this explosion of this kind of communication here is that they have found that in person, we will not share certain vulnerabilities in person that we will online.
Mm-hmm.
This is a
Absolutely.
safer medium for being vulnerable than being in person. And yet a person with special needs tends to be, if they're verbal, they will share some of those vulnerabilities that you have to process in the moment. And
Yeah, there is the phrase that we often use is a filter, and they don't have a filter.
yeah,
And sometimes I think that's the thing that takes people back is they will just come at you with, both barrels and share everything. And that's where we can show the love by not, did you really say that? Just, understand, hey, they're letting you know how they feel and they don't have a whole lot of opportunities to share their thoughts and their feelings. And that's where, I've had to say to those individuals, I'm sorry you've been treated like that. I don't feel it like that way about you. And I feel like I'm apologizing for a whole lot of people and for, sometimes even decades of the way an individual has been treated. Now, how can we overcome that? And how can we let them just be treated like everybody else is?
and that's a very normal thing. I mean, think about you and me or anybody else listening to this podcast. If you have been wounded in a significant way by somebody or something, you remember it. And Satan tends to, just like with our special needs friends, Satan will use that barb to bring us down or bring us back to that place of wounding and make us
Exactly.
question or hurt. And we need to say it all again. I mean, how many of our spouses have heard that same story of, well, back in 19 whatever, and this thing happened. My boss said this, and I, just never recovered from it. And part of it's like, you've been given grace, let's move on. But sometimes it's very hard to do that and time to process. You said also too, when it comes to communication, that it's okay, particularly if a parent or a guardian is there, to ask for help if the communication is a challenge. And so encouraging that. Joel, what I'm hearing in you and say, especially for those who are uncomfortable but would like to do something, is that we really have to step back and change our expectation a little bit. That
Yeah.
and Brene Brown's book, Rising Strong, I think is the first time I encountered this idea, and I've just never forgotten it. That uh, that whole idea of expectations, disappointment comes from unmet expectations, and many of our expectations begin with assumptions. And so, if, for example, on a Sunday morning, it's after church, and I've got about 5 people I really feel that I have to talk to, and my friend with the special needs is there, that I have to, in that moment, make a decision. if I'm going to go and try to get those 5 conversations, but if I'm going to take time to really be here for my friend with special needs, my assumption that I'm going to do all of that right now has to change so
Exactly.
that I can be present. That's
Right.
fair?
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes what I will do is say, you can acknowledge them just so that they understand, okay, I'm not ignoring you, and say, hey, I'll be back in just a minute. It's that proper communication like we do with everybody else. I need to have this conversation, but I'm not ignoring you. I want to come back to something, we were talking about just a minute ago, with that, the way people are treated. I've had people with special needs that tell me point blank, I don't want to be around that person. And they have done this and this and this to me, and I don't want to be around that person. I mean, just like you and I get wounded, and we're like, yeah, I'm going to avoid that situation, that person. Our friends, especially, that's the thing is another one of the assumptions I think we sometimes make is we, in our minds, limit their cognitive skills and their abilities and their understanding and understand.
Yes.
It's they have the same. Many of them have the exact same understanding you and I do, and if they get wounded, that's going to take a lot to overcome, and we need to make an intentional effort to do that.
Yeah. Um, do you find that you run into maybe Christians or non-Christians who just say, I don't like these people?
I way more than I would like to admit, yes. And then I take back, just like anything else, we have to remember first and foremost who they are. They're a blood bought soul that Jesus died for.
Hmm.
And yeah, maybe I'm not going to be their best friend, but can I at least acknowledge that person and not give them the same shunning or excluding treatment that everybody else has given to them? I have people who say, I'm uncomfortable doing it. I'm like, I understand maybe everybody doesn't have the same comfort level that I do. And that's one of the things I've had to teach myself is, okay, Joel, dial down your expectations of other people, but can you at least be decent to them?
Yeah.
These people have been treated with such hate and such shunning and such exclusion that if that's what they get from everybody, how are they going to feel?
Yeah. 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 So Lord, if I'm that congregation member who just says, I just don't like it, disruptive to church, I've got my list of rules and things like that people should follow, and they can't follow that. So therefore, because I know that we run into this, you've talked about it before, that there are some churches that they just won't, we're just not going to work with that because it's too quote unquote disruptive. When we say I don't like that, I appreciate the thought. Yeah, can we at least be decent, and can we at least put ourselves in their shoes and have a little bit of empathy as the starting point, God willing, toward a softer heart towards people with special needs. And if that's me, Lord, challenge my heart. Like there's something in me that's kind of messed up. If I'm just sitting there going, this is the least of these, and I don't, you need to stay over there. There's something wrong in my theology and my understanding of Christianity.
Another thought with that all is, the way that people's uncomfortability sometimes comes out is the old turn and stare at them. And that, if I could ask people one thing, please don't do that. Maybe they're making some noises or they're doing something, and what do we think? We're going to give the person the stare, and that's going to shut them up or whatever. And,
It doesn't work
and
for little kids either, by the way.
unfortunately, these people have gotten the stare so many times
Yeah.
that if that's what we're doing in God's house or among God's people, what kind of a message is that sending to them? And they've gotten that unwelcome message in so many places. And the whole idea behind this conversation is trying to how can we be more welcoming and including? And that's the biggest thing I guess I would beg of people is don't give them the stare. Give them a
Okay.
smile. You don't have to necessarily engage in a deep conversation if that's not your comfort zone, but at least be welcoming to them.
Okay. So as we wind down, what I want to do then, let's and you've mentioned a number of these, and I just want to bring them all together. So let's say I'm a church or I'm a congregation member. We have some people who have special needs who've been coming. Give me your top 5 things for us to do, for me to do, for our church and our culture to be a welcoming place for special needs. So give me number one. I think you already said it. Don't stare, but
Well,
give me your five.
yeah, that don't stare is a part of number one to me is always treat them, interact with them like you would everybody else. And then what can we do to be as welcoming and including? You think about how so often when we get in a group, what's the first thing we do? We go to the people that we know and everything else like that. And we've all seen the situations where there's that one person who's sitting off on the side. And maybe I'm a little bit different because of that. But if we see that situation, make it an intentional thing to go over and at least say hi to them. We don't have to necessarily have a deep conversation if we don't know how to communicate and things like that. And then, some of the other things with this is, like I said, understanding their situation. You don't have to necessarily dwell on it, but understand it. And then what can I do to make that person feel as comfortable with their situation and communicating with them. Is there anything special that they need? And sometimes those types of things, like I said, understanding the sensory needs. Is there something in worship that we need to do to accommodate this person? Some of these individuals, and here again is the uncomfortable thing. Some of these individuals, in some of those situations, you'll see them, they'll have like noise canceling headphones on.
Yep.
You don't have to stare at that person because they got noise canceling headphones on. If that's the way that they're going to be the most comfortable, just accept them and go with it, and don't, like you said, don't stare at them is another big part of it.
Okay. So because I'm a bullet point kind of guy. So I'm gonna throw these back, and you tell me if I'm capturing things accurately. So as a church, and again, this is not exhaustive or anything like that, and this is a process for a human being to learn how to be more welcoming, and it's certainly going to be a process for a church and a church culture too. But number one, treat and interact like normal. I
Yeah.
would put that don't stare right there. Like we don't normally go when you walk in the
Right.
door. Like that would be creepy.
Right.
So treat and interact like normal. Number two, if you have somebody with special needs, seek out someone with special needs. I love that you said be intentional, and you gave people permission to be brief. So if it's not something that you're really comfortable trying to decipher or get into communication, a simple acknowledgement and a hello, good to have you here would be a huge thing. Number three, understand their situation. So that's something a little bit about empathy, but also information too. Just there's a lot of different kinds of special needs, from nonverbal to verbal, cerebral palsy to Down syndrome. There is a spectrum. So understanding their situation, and part of that then is also number four, understanding their sensory needs, which I have seen this being a big deal, because their sensory needs is really going to be a big part of their comfort in our place
Exactly.
of worship.
Right.
And because I asked for five, I would throw this one out there and tell me what you think. But for a church to be um, uh, more welcoming, I think it comes back to me and my self awareness, like work on my own self awareness.
Absolutely.
What am I struggling? What's my fear in this? How am I coming across? How am I responding to this? So my own growth in self awareness for our parishioners, for our church culture. Would those five be a good starting point for
I
people?
would. That's a great list to start with. Yeah, and like you said, it's a process. Um, especially if you've never been in this space and you're learning. Yeah, it's going to take some growth and maybe even forcing myself to do some of these things, but at least try it. And one of my favorite things is I adopt the old Nike slogan, just do it. Just go and do it. You don't have to, have a whole step-by-step process, but,
Yeah,
just go and do it. And maybe you're going to do something, I should do this different the next time and that type of thing. But that's when you get to know the person.
yeah,
Um, and there's some of them that, they'll give you a hug, but there are also some of them that they don't want the touch thing. They're
right,
gonna, and I've learned that from them that yeah,
yeah,
exactly. And
yep.
then that's their signal that gives you permission to back off. But then still, how can you interact with them? That's the understanding thing and getting to learn that person better.
So here's my slogan for you based on all that. Just do it. fail forward, keep going.
I love it. That's super.
Joel, tell me a little bit about where people can learn more about the special ministries that you're a part of. We'll put your contact information in the show notes as well. But tell us a little bit more about specifically what you do, and then we'll call it a podcast.
So, WELS.net/special ministries encompasses 8 areas, and specifically with this, in the underneath that is intellectual and developmental disability ministry. The list that you have there, if they go to WELS.net/IDDM, they're going to find that list of ways to be welcoming and including. I think just looking at that, be willing to learn and grow, and even be a little bit inquisitive in this area. Like I said, the next time you see a person, don't exclude them. And I think the bigger thing is, you've met one person with special needs, you've met one person with special needs. Don't throw the blanket thing. It's just like everybody else, try to get to understand them. I could go on and on about the other areas of special ministries, but it's just the opportunity we have to welcome and include every single last person as Jesus welcomed them. And I'm grateful, the privilege to be able to do that.
That's awesome. Pastor Joel Gaertner is our guest today on Great Questions, Great Conversations, and we've been talking about how we can be better feet and hands of Jesus to our friends with special needs, and that's what our conversation has been here today. So, Joel, I want to thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Awesome. And then for all of our listeners, thank you for spending some time with us too. I hope that this has been a helpful thought for you and I to become more self-aware, and definitely encourage you to share this with people and ministries too, churches who might be able to benefit from some of what we talked here today, and know that there are people like Joel out there who are willing to come and do some teaching and education as well. So with that, I'm Mike Westendorf. You're listening to Great Questions, Great Conversations, a podcast to St. Paul's and and the Bridge in Muskego, Wisconsin. We will see you again next time.